Thank you, Alison, and thank you for giving us a glimmer of hope there that, as you say, there is a window of opportunity to perhaps at the moment to avoid a disaster of the future and to charter our own course, as we said in the report. Can I ask Vince Scappatura to take over and give us the third presentation? Thank you, Vince.
Thank you very much, Bevan, for that invitation, and thanks for the invitation to speak again. I'm going to try and keep my remarks relatively short because, as I mentioned, I've already kind of spoke at length in the previous session. But I do want to just quickly once again extend my thanks and appreciation to IPAN for organising this event, but also for all the help and assistance and army of workers that went into the production of the report. I mean, I was a panel lead for the military and defence section. There was no way I would have the capacity to have done that without all of the amazing support and help from the IPAN team, the submissions that came through, the highlights of the parts that were relevant for myself to read, the whole editing process, the design process, which was just fantastic. I think everyone would agree. It's come out to be an amazingly amazing looking document. So thank you very much for all that help and for also organising this very important discussion about the report. I think, so I'm just going to make two, I think, brief kind of points about the People's Inquiry and some of the issues that I think we need to kind of think about in moving forward. The report, does a wonderfully comprehensive job of spelling out everything that is wrong with the Alliance and Australia's current defence policy. I think there's been a strong focus on that, obviously, in this by all the speakers in this conference today. But more importantly, and as Alison mentioned, it also offers many great avenues to pursue an alternative, which is, I think, what is kind of the particular focus of this session here and the following workshops, which this session is leading into, which I'm very much looking forward to. So the first point I kind of want to make is about what the proper focus, I think, should be of an alternative to the US Alliance should be. And I think kind of Alison stole my thunder a little bit in talking about the importance of foreign policy and diplomacy. And I think it came up in a comment in the previous session about the role of foreign policy in, the unhelpful role, unfortunately, of foreign policy in Australia, of framing a particular narrative around Australia's relationship with the United States and China and who our enemies are. But in actual fact, and this really came through with the submissions and the People's submission, we need more foreign policy, more actual foreign policy, more actual diplomacy. One of the symptoms of the Alliance, the US Alliance, has been not just a militarization of our defense policy, but a militarization of our foreign policy as well. And there's been a strong focus on the security and well-being of Australians being subsumed within defense. Whereas I think that, an alternative defense policy, a genuine alternative defense policy for Australia would first and foremost recognize that the major threats to the defence and security of our nation are primarily non-military in nature, or at the very least, addressing them requires primarily non-military means or solutions. Although the Department of Defence obviously is going to have to adapt to a world of climate disruption, addressing the actual root problem of climate change is, of course, not fundamentally a defence issue. No defence strategy or military alliance is going to stop climate change. Similarly, the threat of nuclear war and nuclear winter, which has been a strong focus, I think, in the discussions today, they are not going to be resolved ultimately via military means until these ghastly and deeply immoral weapons of mass destruction are abolished through diplomacy and arms control agreements. It is only a matter of time before they are used by accident or design. Military strategies like extended nuclear deterrence that Tanta spoke to, they're not a solution, they're a big part of the problem, in fact. And these are the only two, truly existential threats to Australia. And once again, I want to emphasize that, the solutions to these don't lie in defense, they lie elsewhere. Apart from these two, truly existential threats to Australia, there's also the threat of the erosion of democracy that Emma spoke about, not just in the United States, but globally. This rise of extreme right-wing nationalism. which has its roots, I think, really in kind of a deeply unequal and unjust global political and economic system, otherwise known as the rules-based order. And once again, articulating and bringing about a kind of more, democratic and equitable international order based on the UN system and subservient to the UN Charter, and that empowers, democratic institutions. That's primarily, again, a function of diplomacy. It's not defense. So, again, just to reiterate, when thinking about an alternative defense policy for Australia, I think it's worth acknowledging that first and foremost, the security and the well-being of Australia and Australians primarily lie outside of defence, and that defence really should just have a very narrow and limited kind of an important role, but a very narrow and limited one. And I think the People's Inquiry certainly speaks to this basic fact. There's lots of submissions about the importance of investing in peace in the way that Alison spoke to. So that's the first one. The second point I want to raise has to do with kind of identifying, what are the kind of priorities and feasible kind of alternatives in the short term, while remaining, of course, to the longer term, more kind of sustainable goals. There is so much wrong and dysfunctional and harmful about our relationship with the United States that attempting to kind of articulate how to bring about an alternative, it's really hard to know where to start and what to focus on. There's the absence of any real political leadership to stand up to the United States in Australia, and in fact to kind of eagerly and voluntarily subordinate ourselves to the United States. And that's partly, I think, related to kind of the extensive socialization of political elites that's been occurring in Australia for a very long time. It's very kind of effective at preserving the status quo. There's the kind of widespread misunderstanding and lack of awareness among Australian public about the true costs and consequences of the alliance. Although it must be said, as it has been said, that there are signs of hope among the younger generation, which I really think we need to kind of capitalize on. There are the deeply embedded historical and social pathologies that drive the alliance, which again, Emma, eloquently touched on yesterday. This white colonial mindset and these racialized fears of Asia, which have deep historical roots in our country. And there's the other dimension, which I don't think has been touched on so much this conference, which is the economic dimension of Australia's kind of integration into US global capitalism as well. And then, of course, there's the wide and deep military and intelligence integration between both countries that's been, discussed at length, and also the related issues, the military-industrial complex, and so on. And there are actually other, there are other dimensions we could talk about too. So, it's a huge task, and it feels, I think, overwhelming. And it's also the case that developments in this space, they seem to proceed incredibly rapidly. That it's often hard to keep up. By the time you get your head around one issue, there's a new development that we need to be kind of concerned about. In the middle of the production of the People's Inquiry, out of the blue, we had AUKUS. I mean, it really came out of the blue. No one really, saw that coming. And this is another thing for us to be advocating against. And over the last decade, I think in particular, there's virtually been a major new announcement about the expansion of the alliance at every AUSMIN, meeting, and sometimes in between as well. And so, I think as hard as it is to admit it, I think we have to face the reality that, we're not really in a position of strength at the moment. We've just come out of 20 years of deeply unpopular wars in the Middle East, which were, very openly and publicly revealed to be not only total strategic failures, but based on, outright lies. And yet our relationship with the United States continues going from strength to strength. And now we're facing the prospect of Australia eagerly launching itself into another disastrous conflict. And now the stakes are even higher. It's hard to kind of conceptualize or conceive about how and why this is proceeding in the way that it is, given recent history. So we are at a real crisis point. The US and China are on an incredibly dangerous trajectory. And there is every prospect of this situation deteriorating into open conflict in the next 5 to 10 years, if not sooner. The US is deeply committed to maintaining its hegemony, and China will not submit to a US-dominated regional order. If conflict does erupt, it's not inevitable, of course, but I think we are on that trajectory. And if conflict does erupt, I think it's very clear by now that our political leaders have left us in no doubt that we will actively support the United States in that war. Now, I generally like to think of myself as an optimist, but I really can't see a snowflake's chance in hell of Australia ending its alliance with the United States and pursuing an independent and peaceful foreign policy in the next 5 to 10 years. I mean, I'm open to be challenged about that, but from my perspective, I can't see that happening. There is zero indication at the political level of anything like that happening. In fact, it's quite clearly moving in the opposite direction and has been for quite a long time. And to make matters even worse, even if the situation improves between the US and China, I don't necessarily think that that means things will get better for Australia in terms of our dependence on the United States. In fact, there are scenarios where it could get worse. So there are progressive forces in the United States, for example, that are trying really hard to get the United States to abandon its, very offensive military posture against China, and to try and instead adopt a more kind of defensive strategy that would roll back, some of its forward deployed forces around China as a way to kind of de-escalate tensions and reassure Beijing that, the US is not, not an immediate threat. And it sounds like, a very sensible thing to do. And in many ways, of course, it is. Any rollback of US forces in the region, I think, it should be encouraged. However, if, and it's a big if, of course, the US could be convinced to roll back some of its forces and adopt, what's sometimes referred to as an offshore kind of balancing strategy or a denial strategy, where do you think they're going to roll back to? Australia is geographically ideally located for the US to adopt kind of a more defensive offshore balancing strategy. And so, in terms of our priorities, although I firmly believe it's necessary and very worthwhile to sketch out an alternative to the alliance in the long term, I think we are facing a very real crisis in the short term that needs to be addressed within the confines of the alliance. I think it's kind of akin to the climate crisis in some ways. Ideally, to address the climate crisis, we would confront the underlying economic system that has given rise to it. But we're kidding ourselves if we're going to overthrow capitalism in the next 5 to 10 years, right? As wonderful as I think that would be. Similarly, with the crisis in US-China relations, we really need to think hard about what kind of constructive role Australia can play in the short term, short of breaking the alliance. I think there is room to do this, and there's been some comments around this. Alison mentioned some, Richard mentioned some as well, and there are many in the People's Inquiry as well. There's room to do this around nuclear disarmament, around the nuclear ban treaty, around regional arms control dialogues. Australia could be a much stronger advocate in this space without necessarily imperiling the alliance, and it would go some way to reassuring China and kind of de-escalating regional tensions. Richard spoke, about the absolute necessity of getting a commitment, an unwavering commitment from our political leaders that no nuclear weapons will be stationed in Australia. I think that's really important. I think it's feasible to kind of achieve that. When the Trump administration recklessly pulled out of the INF treaty, the Intermediate Nuclear Forces Treaty, Maurice Payne, Australian Defence Minister at the time, quite outrageously, didn't get much commentary in the media, but I thought it was outrageous that we expressed support for that move. Even we initially hinted at the possibility of Australia hosting long-range missiles before Scott Morrison kind of walked back that statement, subsequently announced we're going to develop our own sovereign missile capability. But the US is still looking around the Indo-Pacific for countries to host these post-INF treaty long-range missiles that are currently under development. And I think it would be incredibly provocative and destabilizing, of course, to go ahead with this. And I think Australia could play a more positive role in kind of, actively discouraging this kind of development. We could, okay, right, sorry, man. I said I was going to speak briefly. I don't know what happened to that. So there are other things too, just very quickly, you know, US freedom of navigation exercises, intelligence, surveillance and reconnaissance, provocative ISR activities in the South China Sea that Australia and US participate with. I think we could scale those things back and advocate to do that as well. And I think you know, we really need to think about what positive role Australia could play in you know, pushing for the United States to take a more kind of defensive, less offensive military strategy in the region. I think there are ways that we can think about doing that, but I think we need to think carefully about it because we do face this very acute crisis, and articulating a long-term independent and peaceful Australian policy is very important, and the People's Inquiry does a very good job of that. But I also think about we need to have kind of a roadmap on the way to that place, particularly because we're facing this very immediate crisis, which, to be honest, even if tomorrow we had an independent and peaceful Australian foreign policy and a policy of armed neutrality and independence from the United States, if the US and China still go to war, we will be impacted. Everyone will be impacted, particularly if it goes nuclear. So we can't just think about our defense policy in terms of our own little, you know, silo here. We need to think about it more in terms of regional security and what role we can play in that, irrespective of our relationship with the United States. Thanks.